students! Today I'm reading you the story Green Island. Green Island. Story by Roderick Hunt and Linda Loy. Pictures by Alex Brichta. Mr. Johnson and his class went on a school trip for the week. They went to a big house called Sea Bay House. Mrs. May went too. The children were excited. Sea Bay House was near the sea and there were a lot of interesting things to do. Mr. Johnson unloaded the bus. "Some of these bags and suitcases are heavy," he said. "We're only here for a week." Mrs. May found a toothbrush. "Whose toothbrush is this?" she asked. "Oh no," said Biff, "that's mine." Mr. Johnson showed the boys their room. "You'll sleep in here," he said. "I want the top bunk," shouted Chip. "No, I want the top bunk," shouted William. Mr. Johnson tossed a coin. "Heads or tails?" he asked. Mr. Johnson gave the children maps. Then he took the children for a long walk. When they stopped for a rest, the children looked at their maps. Mr. Johnson showed them some places. "Your map's upside down, Biff," said William. Nick pointed to a little island. "What's that island called?" he asked. "Look on your maps," said Mr. Johnson. "What's the island called?" Chip and Anna knew. "It's called Green Island," they said. Everyone was hungry after the long walk. When they got back, it was time for dinner. The children ate their food and then they helped wash up. "I don't like washing up at home," said William, "but it's fun washing up here." That night, the children were tired, but they could not sleep. Chip told jokes and made silly noises. Mr. Johnson came in. He was angry with Chip. "You'll go to bed at 6 o'clock tomorrow if you make any more noise," he said. The next day, the children went to a beach. Some children worked with Mr. Johnson. They made squares on the beach and looked at everything in each square. Biff found a shell with a crab inside it. "Here's a hermit crab," she said. Some children worked with Mrs. May. They looked carefully in all the rock pools. Nick and William caught a large crab. "Look at this," they shouted. Mrs. May picked up the crab carefully. "We'll look at it, then we'll let it go," she said. Chip and Anna found a seagull. It could not fly. It can't fly because it has oil on its feathers, said Mr. Johnson. Oil is difficult to get off, so be careful, everyone. Don't get oil on you. How do we get the oil off the seagull? Asked Chip. Mr. Johnson took the children to see Mrs. Honey. Mrs. Honey can help the seagull, said Mr. Johnson. I need to clean this poor seagull, said Mrs. Honey. She looked at Anna and Chip. And you need to clean yourselves too, she said. Oil is very bad, said Mrs. Honey. It sticks to animals and birds if it spills into the sea. It is very bad, said Mrs. May. I can't clean it off Chip and Anna. I feel sorry for the seagull, said Chip. What will you do to the seagull? Asked William. It has oil on its feathers, said Mrs. Honey. So first I'll clean the oil off. Then I'll look after it for 1 or 2 weeks. It has to get strong again, and its feathers have to get better. Then I'll let it go. Mrs. Honey looked after a lot of animals. She showed the children a sea otter. Then she gave it some fish. She's a sea otter, she said. I call her Fiona. A boat hit her and hurt her. She's better now, so I'm going to let her go. Sea otters live on Green Island, said Mrs. Honey. If you want, you can come to the island with me and watch me let Fiona go. Mrs. Honey had a boat. Come on, everyone, she said. If we're lucky, we may see some more sea otters. The children went to Green Island in the boat. Mrs. Honey stopped the boat near the island. The children looked carefully. Suddenly, Anna pointed to some rocks. I can see another sea otter, she said. Look, everyone. There aren't many sea otters in the sea now, said Mrs. May. We're lucky to see them. Mrs. Honey opened the cage, and Fiona dived into the sea and swam towards the rocks. Will Fiona be all right now? Asked William. I hope so, said Mrs. Honey. Mrs. Honey took the boat to the other side of the island. You can get out and look around, she said. If you're quiet, you will see a lot of interesting seabirds. The children jumped out of the boat and went to look around the island. William and Nick saw a small cave. Perhaps there's treasure inside, said William. Perhaps there's a secret tunnel and a secret computer base inside, said Nick. When they went to the cave, they found something else. Some drums were in the cave. I don't like this, said Mrs. Honey. Someone has put these drums on Green Island. They are full of toxic waste. Don't go near the drums, said Mr. Johnson. Why do people put these drums here? Asked Biff. It's difficult to get rid of toxic waste, said Mrs. May. It's expensive to do it safely, so people just put the drums here. We should tell the police, said Mr. Johnson. Yes. These drums are dangerous for the birds and animals here, said Mrs. Honey. Suddenly, Chip and William ran to Mr. Johnson. There's a boat coming to the island, said Chip. There are 4 people in it. I don't like this, said Mr. Johnson. Hide, everyone, said Mrs. Honey. We'll watch these people secretly. The boat stopped at the island, and 4 people got out. They lifted some drums out of the boat and began to carry them to the cave. They're putting more toxic waste on the island, said Mrs. Honey. I want everyone to run back to my boat. Be quiet. I have an idea. The children listened to Mrs. Honey. They ran to the boat with Mrs. May and got in. Oh no, said Mrs. May. What shall we do if the boat doesn't start? Are those people dangerous? Asked Chip. Chip and William pushed the boat out with the oars, and Mrs. May started the engine. Good, we're going, said Mrs. May. Will Mrs. Honey's idea work? Asked Biff. Will Mrs. Honey and Mr. Johnson be okay? Asked Nick. Mrs. Honey's idea worked. She and Mr. Johnson took the men's boat. The 4 men could not get off the island without their boat. Hooray! Shouted the children. They don't have a boat. They will have to swim back. What are you doing with our boat? Shouted one of the men. Bring it back! I'll ask the police to bring it back, shouted Mrs. Honey. You can tell them about the drums of toxic waste on Green Island. Oh no, said the man. The police took the people off the island. It was a great idea to take their boat, said Mr. Johnson. You helped me catch them, said Mrs. Honey. Luckily, you were with me. Thank you, everyone. What an adventure, said Mrs. May. Look at those drums of toxic waste, said William. They're so dangerous. People should be very careful with toxic waste. The sea otters will be safe on the island now, said Anna. The next day, the story of Green Island was in the newspaper. The children were excited. I'm going to buy 3 newspapers, said Chip. 1 for me, 1 for Mom and Dad, and 1 for Grandma. I'm famous now, but I don't feel different, said William. The end of the story, Green Island.